In the last few months of the war, thousands of German soldiers received orders they could not fulfill. Entire units were sent to indefensible positions, forced to hold out until the end without support, without supplies, and with no real possibility of retreat. Each front became a stalemate imposed from Berlin. Hitler imposed rigid directives that completely ignored the situation on the ground. He cancelled withdrawals, dismissed generals, and ordered the holding of cities without military value. The destruction of infrastructure, the accelerated mobilization of civilians, and the creation of improvised fortresses formed a system that never had a chance of success. While the army tried to interpret these instructions, the political command demanded absolute resistance, even when the front was already collapsing. Why were these orders given when defeat was evident? What led the generals to carry them out, sabotage them, or ignore them? The collapse of the Reich, birth of the final orders. The summer of 1944 marked the definitive breaking point for the Third Reich. In the first days of June, while the Allied forces were landing in Normandy, establishing the beachhead in France, the German military machine was simultaneously facing a catastrophe of historic proportions on the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration, launched by the Red Army just 3 weeks after D-Day, crushed the German Army Group Center in a series of concentric envelopments that left the Wehrmacht bleeding entire divisions. In a little over 2 months, the Soviet forces advanced more than 600 kilometers to the west, liberating Belarus and reaching the gates of Warsaw and the borders of East Prussia. Hitler observed this dual collapse from his headquarters in East Prussia with a mixture of strategic denial and fanatical determination. The German leader, who since the winter of 1941 had personally assumed operational command of the Wehrmacht, began to respond to each crisis with increasingly rigid instructions that prohibited any withdrawal movement. Traditional military logic was systematically rejected. Instead, Hitler implemented a system of orders based on absolute will and fanatical resistance. Every city, every town, every position had to be held regardless of the consequences. The doctrinal change had deeper roots than mere military desperation. Since the Battle of Moscow in December of 1941, Hitler had developed an unshakable conviction. His order to hold positions at all costs during that first Russian winter had prevented the total collapse of the German forces. The tactical success of that rigid resistance transformed in his mind into a universal strategic truth. Every subsequent retreat was seen as a betrayal of that saving principle. The generals who suggested withdrawals were accused of cowardice. The objective reality of the battlefield took a back seat to the belief that iron will could compensate for any material disadvantage. This transformation reached its rawest expression in February of 1944, when Hitler declared that the war had entered a decisive phase. During a meeting with General Kurt Zeitzler, he made it clear that any suggestion of retreat would be interpreted as defeatism. Officers who proposed withdrawals would be dismissed and replaced by younger and more fanatical commanders. This threat was not empty rhetoric. Throughout 1944 and early 1945, dozens of experienced generals were removed and replaced by officers whose main qualification was their willingness to execute suicidal orders without question. The Nikopol crisis perfectly illustrated this dynamic. When Soviet forces threatened the German positions in this manganese-rich region of the Dnieper, essential for steel production, Zeitzler proposed an orderly retreat to straighten the defensive line. Hitler's reaction was explosive. He lunged at the map table, crumpled the plan, and shouted that the generals must understand why he clung to every territory. It was not about operational experience, but strength of character. The city had to become an impregnable fortress. This approach produced devastating consequences. The German units that could have been saved through tactical withdrawals were trapped in unsustainable defensive pockets. The soldiers fought until ammunition and supplies were exhausted, then were massacred or captured. The losses multiplied exponentially. The German divisions bled out in battles with no strategic sense. The Wehrmacht was transformed into a static army doomed to defend positions until annihilation. The concept of fortress city emerged as the most visible manifestation of this doctrine. On March 8, 1944, Hitler issued Führer Order No. 11, establishing the creation of strongholds on the Eastern Front. These fortresses were to be allowed to be encircled to immobilize enemy forces. The theory was simple. A surrounded garrison would force the Soviets to divert troops, slowing down the overall advance. In practice, this strategy ignored the realities of modern warfare. The designated cities lacked fortifications, natural defenses, heavy weaponry, and adequate supply. Ternopil was the first victim. This small Ukrainian city lacked everything necessary to withstand a siege. Its garrison of 4,600 men had few heavy weapons and scarce artillery. Basic rations were lacking from the first day. When General Hans Schrepfer assumed command on the 10th of March, his first action was to request a functional radio, because the city lacked operational communications. His second act was to send a message to Hitler explaining that the situation was desperate. He was dismissed immediately. His replacement reached the same conclusion and was also ignored. The result was predictable and brutal. The defenders held out for weeks until the garrison was annihilated in April, having achieved 0 significant strategic objectives. The pattern was repeated all over the Eastern Front. Breslau was declared a fortress city in August of 1944. Hitler ordered that it be defended without withdrawal or surrender. The siege that began in February of 1945 and lasted 82 days devastated the city on a scale that surpassed Berlin or Dresden. By the time the garrison surrendered on the 6th of May, 2/3 of Breslau lay in ruins. The civilian population was trapped in this apocalyptic violence. On the Western Front, the dynamic was similar. After Normandy, the German forces fought fiercely for 2 months. Hitler insisted on the primacy of the West, concentrating resources there while the East collapsed. When the Western Front crumbled in August, the Allies advanced towards the German borders. Hitler's response was characteristic. He gathered all available forces and launched the Ardennes counter-offensive in December. The Battle of the Bulge represented Hitler's last strategic gamble. Its objective was to divide the Allied lines, retake Antwerp, and fracture the alliance between Great Britain and the United States. The German generals did not share the enthusiasm. They knew that the Wehrmacht of 1944 was not the force of 1940, but Hitler insisted. The offensive began on the 16th of December with a surprise attack that initially caught the American forces off guard, but the advance stalled quickly. By the end of December, the German momentum had stopped. The battle cost more than 80,000 American casualties and between 80,000 and 100,000 German ones. The strategic cost for Germany was greater: 2 fewer panzer armies to defend against the Soviet offensive. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched its massive winter offensive from the Vistula. The forces of Konev and Zhukov swept through the German defenses with overwhelming numerical superiority. The Soviets outnumbered the Germans 5 or 6 to 1 in troops, 6 to 1 in artillery and tanks. In weeks, they liberated Warsaw, took the Baltic states, captured Danzig, and approached the Oder, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. Hitler faced this catastrophe with a stubbornness that defied all logic. He refused to stop the Ardennes and transfer troops to the east. He refused to evacuate 30 isolated divisions in Courland. Guderian was left with only 12 armoured divisions to support 50 weak infantry divisions stretched 1,000 kilometers. It was simple math. Germany did not have enough soldiers to defend such an extensive front against such a superior enemy. Thus was born the context of Hitler's final orders, a combination of catastrophic military reality, total ideological denial, and absolute authoritarianism. The German generals functioned as mere transmitters of lunatic orders. The command system had transformed into a rigid structure where loyalty to Hitler surpassed any military consideration. And millions of Germans, both soldiers and civilians, would pay the final price of this systematic madness: the radicalization of command, from maneuver to absolute resistance. The transformation of the German High Command from a professional institution to an instrument of ideological fanaticism was a gradual process that reached its peak during the final months of the war. The Wehrmacht had entered into conflict with a Prussian military tradition that valued tactical initiative, operational flexibility, and apolitical professionalism. By 1945, those principles had been systematically dismantled and replaced by a culture of blind obedience where questioning orders was equivalent to treason. The turning point came with the failure of the assassination attempt on Hitler on the 20th of July of 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb at the Prussian Eastern headquarters in an attempt to assassinate the Führer and trigger a military coup that would negotiate peace. The bomb exploded, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. The revenge was immediate and brutal. Thousands of officers, civil servants, and intellectuals were arrested. Hundreds were executed after summary trials. The purges eliminated any trace of potential opposition within the army and ensured that no military elite would dare to mobilize again against the regime. The psychological impact of the attack on Hitler was profound and lasting. His distrust towards the officer corps turned into active paranoia. The aristocratic generals with monarchical roots were now considered potential traitors. Only the officers whose loyalty to National Socialism was beyond any doubt could occupy positions of real authority. Professional military competence became secondary to political loyalty. This transformation had devastating consequences for the operational conduct of the war. The internal terror became a fundamental element to keep German civilians submissive until the end, long after they had lost all faith in Hitler. The popularity of the Führer was in free fall by 1944 and 1945. Allied bombings had destroyed entire cities. The casualty lists reached astronomical numbers. The shortage of food and fuel affected even previously protected urban areas. Goebbels' propaganda about the final victory sounded increasingly hollow. But the Nazi regime, coordinated by Martin Bormann, had increasingly assumed control of the German state apparatus, displacing the traditional civil bureaucracy. The purges after the 20th of July ensured that no elite opposition dared to organize. But the terror was not limited to the upper classes. Ordinary soldiers who showed signs of weakness or defeatism faced immediate and lethal consequences. Mobile courts-martial traveled through the rear areas searching for deserters. Military tribunals handed down death sentences with terrifying speed. Thousands of German soldiers were executed by their own compatriots during the last few months for crimes such as abandoning positions, attempting to surrender, or expressing doubts about the final victory. Executions not only punished the accused, but also served as a brutal warning. The bodies of the executed were left hanging in public places with signs identifying their alleged crimes. A soldier could be shot for retreating without explicit orders. An officer could be hanged for suggesting that a position was indefensible. A commander could face court-martial for evacuating civilians without authorization. The message was clear. The only option was to fight to the death or face execution for cowardice. This atmosphere of terror fundamentally transformed the relationship between officers and soldiers. The field commanders, who traditionally had exercised considerable discretionary authority, now operated under constant surveillance. The political commissars of the Nazi Party, SS officers, and security agents monitored the military units looking for signs of defeatism. A general who ordered a retreat without explicit authorization risked not only his career, but his life. A colonel who expressed doubts could be denounced and arrested. A captain who showed compassion towards the civilian population could be accused of weakening the will to resist. The generals faced a terrible dilemma. Many recognized that the orders they received were militarily absurd and inevitably led to greater losses without strategic benefit. They knew that defending every town and city until annihilation simply accelerated total destruction without slowing the enemy's advance. They understood that fortress cities were deadly traps that wasted valuable soldiers. But they also knew that openly disobeying meant immediate execution and replacement by a fanatic willing to carry out those same orders. This situation produced various responses. Some generals opted for blind obedience, executing every order no matter how irrational it was. These officers had internalized the Nazi ideology or decided that their survival depended on complete conformity. They followed the directives to the letter, sacrificed entire divisions, and reported non-existent tactical successes to maintain the illusion that the iron will was working. Other generals adopted a more subtle strategy of passive resistance. Officially, they accepted the orders, but implemented them with modifications that softened their most lethal aspects. A commander might receive instructions to defend a city to the last man, but interpreted this as defending until the situation was clearly impossible before authorizing a nighttime withdrawal. Another general might receive orders to hold a specific line, but gradually repositioned his forces through technical adjustments that fulfilled the letter while violating its spirit. This passive resistance required considerable political and military skill. The generals had to demonstrate enough public fanaticism to avoid suspicion while making decisions that saved German lives. They had to report their actions in a way consistent with the orders received while having taken different paths. They had to balance nominal loyalty to the regime with real responsibility towards their troops and the civilian population. A notable case involved General Dietrich von Cöltitz, military commander of Paris, in August of 1944. Hitler had ordered that the city not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Cöltitz received detailed instructions to destroy monuments, bridges, industrial facilities, and government buildings before the Allied arrival. The orders were clear and unequivocal, but Cöltitz did not execute them. When the Allies entered Paris, the city was intact. Cöltitz surrendered without implementing the ordered destruction. He later claimed this was the moment he understood that Hitler was insane, although French historians have questioned this characterization as self-serving fantasy. A similar pattern occurred in the Netherlands at the end of 1944. Hitler issued orders to implement a scorched earth policy when it became obvious that the Allies would return to the country. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reichskommissar in charge during the occupation, managed to significantly limit the scope of the execution of these orders. The destruction that finally occurred was much less than that contemplated in the original directives. Seyss-Inquart had found ways to delay, modify, and minimize the implementation of instructions he considered excessively destructive. The most significant example of high-level sabotage involved Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production. On the 19th of March 1945, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, an order demanding the destruction of all German infrastructure to prevent its use by the Allied forces. The decree ordered the destruction of industrial facilities, power plants, transportation networks, bridges, warehouses, and any other infrastructure useful to the enemy. The responsibility for executing this order fell on Speer. According to his own testimony, Speer was horrified by the directive and lost faith in the Führer. He deliberately did not comply with the order. Instead, he requested to be granted exclusive power to implement the plan, then use that authority to convince generals and Gauleiters to ignore the instructions. Hitler apparently remained unaware of this disobedience until the end of the war. Speer claimed that during his last meeting with Hitler on the 22nd of April in the Berlin bunker, he admitted to having deliberately disobeyed. Hitler supposedly became enraged, but allowed him to leave. However, Speer's account has been disputed by some historians, with Richard Evans describing it as pure invention. The exact truthfulness of Speer's claims is less important than the general pattern they illustrate. Even at the highest levels of the Nazi regime, some figures recognized the folly of total destruction, policies, and sought ways to mitigate their implementation. But these instances of disobedience were notable exceptions precisely because they were rare. The norm was obedience, driven by a combination of terror, ideological fanaticism, personal loyalty to Hitler, and simple bureaucratic inertia. Most of the German generals continued carrying out irrational orders during the last few months. Part of this obedience stemmed from fear of personal consequences, but part also came from a genuine loyalty to the regime and to Hitler personally. Contrary to the popular narrative influenced by the memoirs of surviving generals, many of Hitler's controversial decisions had some basis in reality and were not made on a whim. Hitler usually consulted with his subordinates before making important decisions. The orders to not retreat, although frequently disastrous, were not completely irrational from a certain strategic perspective. In a defensive war against numerically superior enemies, maintaining the initiative through local counterattacks could be preferable to constant retreats. This was the same reason why Stalin ordered counterattacks in 1941 and 1942. The problem was not the underlying theory, but the fanatical application without considering specific tactical realities. Fortress cities were not completely irrational as a concept either. Some were garrisoned by second-line troops who might effectively have been lost in retreats. Forcing the enemy to divert resources to besiege them could have some tactical value. The problem was the indiscriminate application to poorly prepared cities and the waste of first-line troops that could have been used more effectively. Until the end, Hitler and some followers held hopes for a miraculous change. These were not completely fanciful given European history. Germany invoked the precedent of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg of the 18th century, when Russian Empress Elizabeth suddenly died and her successor pulled Russia out of the war against Prussia, saving Frederick the Great. Rumors that the Allied coalition might split gave false hope. Even in May of 1945, some entertained fantastic ideas that Great Britain and the United States would switch sides and join Nazi Germany against Soviet Russia. The lower ranks of the German army remained surprisingly effective and motivated until very late. The privates and junior officers were frequently convinced Nazis who considered the assassination attempt of the 20th of July as a disgrace. For them, fighting until the end was not the result of terror, but of genuine ideological conviction. They believed in the cause. They believed in Hitler. They believed that iron will would eventually prevail. By March of 1945, the German command structure had reached a state of almost total dysfunction. Hitler operated from his bunker in Berlin, increasingly isolated from reality. His orders were based on outdated maps and optimistic reports. Divisions that no longer existed were moved on these maps. Impossible counterattacks were ordered. The gap between the orders and operational reality constantly widened. The generals faced the impossible choice between executing suicidal orders or risking execution for disobedience. The German command system had transformed into a dysfunctional structure paralyzed by terror, ideology, and denial of reality. The decisive orders: destruction, mobilization, and useless fortresses. During the last 6 months of the war, Hitler issued 3 types of directives that defined the final agony of the Third Reich. The first encompassed the scorched earth policies that demanded the systematic destruction of German infrastructure. The second involved the forced mobilization of the civilian population through the Volkssturm. The third continued the creation of fortress cities that trapped soldiers and civilians in apocalyptic sieges. Together, these directives transformed the last months of the war into a nightmare of self-inflicted destruction. The Nero Decree of the 19th of March of 1945 represented the most extreme expression of the self-destruction mentality that dominated Hitler's thinking. The order demanded the complete demolition of all infrastructure useful to enemy forces. Industrial facilities were to be dynamited, power plants rendered unusable, railway networks destroyed, bridges blown up, warehouses set on fire, communication systems dismantled. The order did not allow for exceptions based on civilian needs or future reconstruction possibilities. The logic was brutally simple. If Germany could not win the war, it did not deserve to survive as a nation. Hitler had declared that Germany would be a world power or it would be nothing. This binary vision left no room for defeat, followed by reconstruction. The German population had failed in its historical mission. Therefore, it did not deserve the basic tools of civilization. The survivors would have to face the consequences without infrastructure, without industry, without basic means of subsistence. This was not the first time Hitler tried to destroy irrecoverable territory. In Paris, during August of 1944, he had ordered that the city should not fall except as a field of ruins. The specific instructions included demolition of monuments, bridges over the Seine, government facilities, and industrial structures. Dietrich von Koltitz received these orders directly, but he did not execute them. When the Allied forces entered, they found Paris essentially intact. The Netherlands showed a similar pattern. At the end of 1944, Hitler ordered scorched earth. The dikes were to be destroyed, flooding territory. The port facilities demolished. The transportation infrastructure rendered unusable. But Arthur Seyss-Inquart managed to substantially limit the scope. Although there was some sabotage, the scale was much smaller than that contemplated in the original directives. The Nero decree was different in ambition and scope. It was not a specific city, but a systematic order that covered the entire territory of the Reich that would be occupied. The destruction had to be total and methodical. Every major bridge, every power plant, every industrial facility, every railway junction. Full implementation would have left Germany as an industrial wasteland incapable of sustaining its population. Albert Speer, as Minister of Armaments, faced the responsibility of executing this apocalyptic directive. He immediately understood that full implementation would condemn the civilian population to massive famine and total collapse. Without power plants, the cities would be left without electricity. Without bridges, the transportation of food would be impossible. Without railways, the distribution of supplies would cease. Without industrial infrastructure, reconstruction would be impossible for generations. The decree was a collective death sentence. Speer opted for systematic sabotage. He requested exclusive authority to implement the decree, then used that authority to convince generals and Gauleiters to ignore the instructions. He traveled personally organizing passive resistance. He argued that the destruction was militarily unnecessary and civically catastrophic. Some commanders agreed and discreetly disobeyed. Others needed more persuasion. Some simply lacked the practical means to implement large-scale destruction. The result was irregular implementation. Some installations were destroyed, particularly where fanatical SS officers were overseeing. Other places were saved by quick action from local commanders. Some bridges were blown up, but many remained intact. Some industrial plants were sabotaged, but others continued operating until they were captured. The destruction that occurred was significant, but far less than that contemplated. Hitler apparently remained ignorant of the sabotage until very late. According to Speer, during his last meeting in the bunker on the 22nd of April, he confessed to having deliberately disobeyed. Hitler supposedly became enraged, but allowed Speer to leave. The veracity of this account has been questioned. Richard Evans describes it as pure invention, but Speer's narrative was important for his defense in Nuremberg. While the scorched earth was irregularly implemented, another directive was transforming German society. On the 18th of October of 1944, Hitler formally established the Volkssturm, a national militia that would conscript all men between 16 and 60 years not already serving in the Wehrmacht. The order framed this as the final national uprising against invading enemies after the failure of allies and 5 years of war. Heinrich Himmler was appointed Reichsführer of the Volkssturm, responsible for organization and training. Tactical operations would fall under the Wehrmacht when the units were engaged in combat. The decree emphasized ideological commitment over professional military standards. Members were required to swear unconditional obedience to Hitler and commit their lives to the defense of the Reich. Local Nazi Party leaders would organize the units, ensuring that the militia remained under direct political control. The decision reflected desperation of personnel by the end of 1944. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses on both fronts. More than 3 million German soldiers had died or been incapacitated on the Eastern Front since 1941. The Soviet offensives of 1944, particularly Bagration, had destroyed entire divisions. The battles in the West after Normandy had bled the forces. There simply were not enough men left to fill the gaps. The concept was inspired by the Prussian Landsturm from 1813 to 1815, which had fought against Napoleon as guerrilla forces. Plans to form a national militia were proposed by Guderian in 1944. The army lacked personnel to stop the Soviet onslaught, so additional categories were called: those in non-essential jobs, previously considered unfit, overage, underage, and those recovering from wounds. The basic unit was a battalion of 642 men, composed mostly of members of the Hitler Youth, elderly people, people with disabilities, and people previously unfit. Despite Bormann's effort, who under Hitler's orders recruited almost 6 million, the intended force was never reached. By the end, approximately 700 battalions had been organized. The equipment was notoriously inadequate. Although there was an attempt to provide military uniforms, these did not reach everyone. Many wore improvised uniforms or uniforms from their civilian jobs. The brown uniform of the Hitler Youth was common, creating confusion on the Eastern Front, where Soviet soldiers sometimes did not shoot at them, thinking they were on their side. The weaponry was equally problematic. They received obsolete weapons, captured or hastily manufactured. Some received rifles from the First World War. Others obtained weapons captured from French, Polish, or Czechoslovakian armies. Machine guns were scarce, artillery practically non-existent. The most effective weapon was the Panzerfaust, an anti-tank rocket launcher that required little skill and could effectively destroy tanks at close range. The training was minimal. Members were recruited from November of 1944, but just 4 months later, the Red Army was entering East Prussia and the Americans were crossing the Rhine. The advance required the Wehrmacht to urgently need all its experienced men at the front. The Volkssturm recruits lacked proper instructors. Many had been veterans of the First World War with fundamental notions of military discipline, but teenagers and previously unfit men had little or no experience. Hitler and Himmler insisted on filling these militias with nationalist fanaticism to determine them to fight to their annihilation. For this reason, the Volkssturm did not operate under the direct control of the Wehrmacht, but under the direction of the Nazi Party. This dual structure created constant confusion. The units technically fell under military authority in combat, but remained under political supervision at other times. Performance varied dramatically. On the Eastern Front, where soldiers feared Soviet reprisals and propaganda about Bolshevik atrocities resonated, units occasionally fought with determination. In Gumbinnen, East Prussia, at the end of 1944, Volkssturm formations managed to temporarily halt the advance of the Red Army. When they were well positioned with Panzerfausts and commanded by experienced officers, they could inflict significant casualties. On the Western Front, the performance was different. The indifference of the regular army and the belief that the Western Allies were not seeking annihilation convinced many units to flee or surrender. In Remagen, when they saw the regular army retreat, they simply surrendered. Without competent leadership and commanded by party incompetence, these units were disintegrating. The most extensive use occurred during the Battle of Berlin. Approximately 40,000 members, mainly young people between 13 and 18 years old and elderly people, were used to defend the capital. Between 20,000 and 40,000 military and civilian deaths occurred. The Volkssturm was sacrificed in street fighting against an overwhelmingly superior enemy. The casualty rates revealed the fundamental brutality. During limited exposure, they suffered losses of 70 or 80%. In the East, approximately 650,000 saw action. Many perished. Others deserted when the Nazi leaders fled. The units disintegrated when their political overseers abandoned their posts. The third category continued the fortress city policy. Throughout 1944 and early 1945, Hitler designated numerous cities as strongholds to be defended to the last man. They were to allow themselves to be encircled to immobilize enemy forces. In theory, they would have fulfilled a strategic function by slowing the advance. In practice, they lacked the necessary fortifications, supplies, and preparation. Breslau became the most devastating example. Declared a fortress city on the 24th of August 1944, it was ordered to defend itself without retreat. The siege that began in February 1945 lasted 82 days, during which it suffered destruction that exceeded Berlin or Dresden. 200,000 civilians were trapped. By the time the garrison surrendered on the 6th of May, 2/3 lay in ruins. Königsberg faced a similar fate. Designated an invincible bastion by Hitler, it was surrounded and besieged. The civilians who had not evacuated were trapped. Orders prohibited preventive evacuations under the theory that civilian presence would boost morale. When it fell, it had been devastated. The pattern was repeated in dozens of locations. Each fortress city turned into a death trap. The garrisons fought until they exhausted ammunition, then faced annihilation or surrender. The trapped civilians, suffered terrible privations, constant bombardments, and frequently atrocities. The policy maximized suffering without achieving significant strategic gains. These three categories of orders, the Nero Decree, the Volkssturm, and the fortress cities, defined the last months. Together, they represented national self-destruction that prioritized ideological symbolism over human welfare. Full implementation would have turned Germany into a cemetery. That many were sabotaged or implemented partially saved countless German lives, but could not alter the final outcome. The internal fracture, obedience, sabotage, and tactical reinterpretation. The relationship between Hitler and his generals during the last months was fundamentally dysfunctional. The orders emanating from the bunker reflected a disconnection with the reality of the battlefield. The military commanders faced an impossible dilemma: execute directives that would lead to annihilation of their troops or risk their lives through disobedience. The response of the German officer corps was varied, ranging from fanatical obedience, deliberate sabotage, and creative reinterpretation of impossible orders. The spectrum began with generals who executed each order without question. These officers, products of years of Nazi indoctrination or convinced that their survival depended on total conformity, implemented the most irrational directives with bureaucratic precision. When they were ordered to defend a city without strategic value to the last man, they organized that defense methodically. When instructed to maintain an unsustainable line, they positioned their troops and awaited inevitable annihilation. They had internalized the logic that iron will could compensate for material disadvantages, or simply decided that blind obedience was their only option. At the opposite end were officers who opted for forms of active or passive resistance. They recognized that the orders were militarily absurd and morally indefensible. Some looked for ways to discreetly sabotage the implementation of particularly destructive directives. Others reinterpreted orders preserving some margin for tactical rationality. A few openly disobeyed, although this option was extremely dangerous. Between these extremes there was a considerable grey area where the majority operated. These commanders had learned the art of appearing to obey while subtly modifying the implementation. A general might receive instructions to hold a position at all costs, but interpreted this as holding until further resistance only resulted in losses without benefit. Another commander might receive orders to defend every meter, but implemented nightly withdrawals that technically maintained contact while preserving combat capability. This reinterpretation required considerable political skill in addition to military competence. The generals had to write reports that described their actions consistently with orders received, even when the reality had been different. They had to use ambiguous language that satisfied fanatic supervisors while leaving room for rational decisions. They had to demonstrate sufficient public loyalty to avoid suspicion, while secretly prioritizing the preservation of forces and protection of civilians. General Gotthard Heinrici illustrates this type of pragmatic commander. Heinrich developed a reputation as a master of defensive warfare, skilled in extracting maximum benefit from positions while preserving forces. When he assumed command of Army Group Vistula in March of 1945, he inherited a desperate situation. He received explicit orders to hold each position and defend Berlin to the last man. But he understood that static resistance guaranteed annihilation without slowing the Soviet advance. Heinrich implemented a flexible defense strategy that violated the spirit of the orders while technically maintaining their letter. He identified actual defensive lines and secretly evacuated frontline positions that would be bombarded. When the offensive of the 16th of April began, the shelling fell on empty trenches. The German forces, in secondary lines, faced the assault from more favorable positions. This tactic could not stop the advance, but maximized enemy casualties while preserving German forces. Heinrich's actions eventually attracted Hitler's ire. On April 28th, Hitler ordered him to be dismissed for allegedly retreating without authorization, but by then the command system was so disintegrated that the order had little effect. Heinrich continued directing operations as Berlin fell. His case illustrates both the possibilities and the limits of tactical disobedience. Another example involved General Theodor Busse, commander of the 9th Army, facing the Soviet offensive from the Oder. Busse received orders to hold positions and then counterattack towards Berlin to break the Soviet encirclement. These orders were operationally impossible. The 9th Army was surrounded, short of ammunition and fuel, facing overwhelmingly superior forces. Busse chose to ignore the orders and instead organized an attempt to break the encirclement to the west to reach American lines. This move saved tens of thousands of soldiers from death or Soviet capture. Technically, it constituted direct disobedience. But by the end of April, Hitler's control over his armies was more nominal than real. Communications were broken. The chain of command had disintegrated. The generals made decisions based on immediate tactical realities. Fortress cities provided another context where commanders faced terrible decisions between obedience and humanity. The appointed commanders knew that the orders were death sentences for their garrisons and civilian populations. Some executed the orders to the letter, organizing fanatic defenses that ended in massacres. Others sought ways to mitigate the disaster. General Hermann Niehoff, commander of Breslau, chose to execute his orders with Prussian determination. He organized a meticulous defense that lasted 82 days. During that time, Breslau was reduced to rubble. The civilian population suffered indescribable horrors. Niehoff did not surrender until the 6th of May, 2 days after the surrender of Berlin. By then, 2/3 of the city had been destroyed. The defense had not fulfilled any significant strategic objective, but Niehoff had obeyed. Other fortress commanders sought to limit the disaster. Some secretly facilitated the evacuation of civilians despite explicit prohibitions. Others negotiated surrenders when the situation became untenable. A few abandoned positions when it became clear that resistance would only cause more suffering without benefit. The ethical dilemma was genuine and terrible. On one hand, they had sworn allegiance to Hitler. Prussian military tradition emphasized obedience and duty fulfillment. Disobeying orders constituted treason according to traditional standards. On the other hand, these commanders had responsibilities towards their troops and civilians. Executing orders that guaranteed death without strategic purpose violated other principles of professional military conduct. The response of each commander depended on multiple factors: their ideological commitment to Nazism, their evaluation of personal consequences of disobedience, their sense of responsibility, their judgment on tactical realities, and their personal character. There was no simple correct answer. Each option involved significant moral costs. The civilian population added another dimension. By mid-1945, the majority of civilians had lost faith in victory. The bombings had destroyed cities. The casualty lists had devastated families. The shortages created real famine. The propaganda about miracle weapons sounded absurd in the face of enemy armies occupying territory. The civilians wanted the war to end. But the regime had created an atmosphere of terror that kept the population submissive. The public executions of defeatists served as warnings. The Gestapo agents continued to operate. The Nazi Party leaders exercised tyrannical control. Expressing a desire to surrender could result in execution. Hanging a white flag could lead to public hanging. This atmosphere meant that even commanders who wanted to minimize civilian suffering faced resistance from party authorities. A general attempting to evacuate civilians could be blocked by the local Gauleiter. A commander considering surrender could be reported by political commissars. The Nazi structure created mutual surveillance that made humanitarian action difficult. The Cologne case illustrates these dynamics. When the American forces approached in March of 1945, the Gauleiter insisted on fanatical defense. The military commander recognized that defending the city would only cause more suffering without benefit, but he lacked the authority to overrule the Gauleiter. The result was destructive combat that further devastated the city. Thousands of civilians were trapped, many perished. The defense delayed the advance just a few days at a terrible human cost. Contrasts between Eastern and Western fronts also affected decisions. In the East, soldiers faced genuine fear of Soviet capture. The propaganda about atrocities contained enough truth to be convincing. The soldiers knew they had committed massive crimes against Soviet populations. They feared justified revenge. This fear created motivation to continue fighting. The commanders who considered surrender faced resistance from troops who preferred death in combat over capture. In the West, the dynamics were different. The soldiers generally believed that they would be treated reasonably as prisoners by Americans and British. The absence of comparable massive crimes meant less fear. The commanders in the West had greater flexibility to consider surrenders. Many units simply stopped fighting seriously during the last weeks, surrendering when they were isolated. This difference illustrates how the prior actions of the regime limited the commander's options. The crimes committed in the East during 1941 to 1944 created a dynamic where surrender seemed less viable. The relatively conventional treatment of Western populations left room for a less catastrophic termination. By the end of April of 1945, the command structure had effectively collapsed. Hitler was isolated in his besieged bunker. Communications with units were intermittent or non-existent. The generals made independent decisions based on local circumstances. The system where every decision required Hitler's approval had become non-functional. The irony was obvious. The attempt to completely centralize control had produced total disintegration. The last few days saw commanders acting with considerable autonomy. Some continued to fight fanatically. Others negotiated local surrenders. A few attempted to move forces westward to surrender to Americans. There was no strategic coherence or coordination. Each commander did what they considered best given their circumstances, convictions, and options. The Reich that had demanded absolute obedience ended in chaotic fragmentation, where central authority had ceased to exist. The impact on the front line, human and military consequences of the final mandate. Hitler's final orders were not abstract strategic directives, but death sentences executed on millions of real people. German soldiers, civilians trapped in combat zones, and entire populations paid the price of decisions made in bunkers far from the reality of the battlefield. The human and military consequences of these orders transformed the last months of the war into a catastrophe of historic proportions that far exceeded the suffering an early surrender would have caused. The statistics tell part of the story. Between July of 1944 and May of 1945, more German civilians died than in all the previous years of the conflict combined. More than 400,000 perished from Allied bombings. Up to 500,000 additional civilian deaths occurred as a result of the Soviet invasion and occupation of the eastern regions of Germany, accompanied by mass rapes and atrocities. In the military realm, the figures are equally devastating. 49% of all German military deaths in World War II occurred during the last 10 months of the conflict. nearly half of all German soldiers who died in 6 years of war perished after the July of 1944 assassination attempt. These figures reflect a brutal reality. Hitler's orders to resist until total annihilation exponentially multiplied human suffering without altering the final outcome of the war. If the assassination attempt on Hitler had succeeded and the war had ended in 1944, the lives of approximately half of the German soldiers who died could have been saved. The hundreds of thousands of civilians who perished during the last months would also have survived. The cities that were reduced to rubble in 1945 would have remained relatively intact. Post-war reconstruction would have been infinitely less difficult. The Eastern Front was where the consequences were most catastrophic. The German soldiers fought with determination, born from genuine terror of Soviet capture. Nazi propaganda about Bolshevik atrocities contained enough truth to be convincing. The German troops had witnessed or participated in mass crimes against Soviet populations during the invasion. They knew they had burned villages, executed prisoners, and participated in genocidal policies. They feared justified revenge. This fear turned into defensive fanaticism that prolonged the agony. The battles in the East during the first months of 1945 were particularly bloody. When the Red Army launched its massive winter offensive on the 12th of January, the German forces were numerically outnumbered in proportions of 5 or 6 to 1. The Soviet superiority in artillery, tanks, and self-propelled artillery was equally overwhelming. But the German units continued to fight fiercely even when they were surrounded and cut off from supplies. Hitler's orders to hold every position ensured that these units were annihilated rather than withdraw to fight another day. The result was a constant drain of the best remaining German units. Divisions that could have been preserved through tactical withdrawals were destroyed defending positions without strategic value. Veteran soldiers who had survived years of combat died in senseless battles. Young replacements with minimal training were sent to the front and annihilated within days. The German replacement system could not keep up with the losses. German divisions operated with fractions of their nominal strength. Battalions that should have 800 men had 200. The logistical collapse amplified the disaster. The German supply networks completely disintegrated during the last months. The units at the front lacked ammunition, fuel, food, and basic medical equipment. The soldiers fought with inadequate rations. The wounded died due to lack of medical treatment. The vehicles were abandoned due to lack of fuel. The artillery fell silent due to a shortage of shells. The armored units were transformed into immobile metal boxes when the fuel ran out. This logistical collapse was not inevitable. Germany still possessed significant industrial resources at the beginning of 1945. The problem was that these resources could not be effectively transported to the front. Allied bombings had destroyed railway networks. The bridges over major rivers had been knocked down. The roads were congested with columns of civilian refugees fleeing west. The German transportation system had collapsed under the combined pressure of strategic bombings and impossible operational demands. The fortress cities illustrated the human consequences of Hitler's orders in their rawest form. Breslau suffered 82 days of siege that reduced the city to ruins. The trapped civilian population faced starvation, constant bombing, and street fighting. The garrison soldiers fought without hope of relief or victory. When they finally surrendered on the 6th of May, they had held out 2 more days than Berlin. This prolonged resistance achieved no strategic objective. It did not significantly divert Soviet forces from the main advance. It simply caused more death and destruction without purpose. Königsberg faced a similar fate. The civilians who had not evacuated in time were trapped when the Soviet encirclement closed in. Hitler's orders prohibited preventive evacuations under the theory that the civilian presence would boost the defenders' morale. In reality, the trapped civilians simply added mouths to feed in a besieged city with limited supplies. When Königsberg finally fell after a brutal siege, the civilian population had suffered horrors that rivaled anything experienced during the war. The late evacuation of eastern regions of Germany was another catastrophic consequence of Hitler's policies. The Nazi regional leaders had been given implicit instructions to keep civilian populations in place until the latest possible moment. To evacuate prematurely implied defeatism and lack of faith in the defense. As a result, millions of German civilians remained in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia until the Red Army was literally at the gates. When they finally fled, they did so in horrible winter conditions, with columns of refugees being bombarded by Soviet planes and attacked by ground troops. Operation Hannibal, the massive naval evacuation of German civilians and soldiers from Baltic ports, was the largest rescue operation of the Second World War. Between January and May of 1945, the German Navy evacuated between 1 and 2 million people across the Baltic, far surpassing the scale of the famous Dunkirk rescue. This operation was successful only because Admiral Karl Dönitz deliberately disobeyed Hitler's orders not to withdraw troops from the Baltic pockets. If Dönitz had followed the instructions to the letter, those millions of people would have been trapped and probably died or been captured. The suffering of German civilians was exacerbated by the policies of the Nazi regime itself. The regional party leaders who had insisted on keeping populations in place frequently fled at the last moment, abandoning civilians to their fate. These Nazi officials ensured their own evacuation, while the populations they had forced to stay faced the arrival of the Red Army without leadership or organization. The Soviet atrocities against the German civilian population during the occupation of the eastern regions were systematic and massive. The rapes were particularly widespread, with estimates of victims reaching hundreds of thousands. These atrocities were partially revenge for the German crimes committed on Soviet territory, partially a result of the collapse of discipline in the advanced Soviet units, and partially a deliberate policy to terrorize the German population. On the Western Front, the consequences were less catastrophic, but still significant. German civilians in the West were generally treated better by the American and British occupying forces. But Hitler's insistence on defending every town and every city still caused massive destruction and unnecessary civilian losses. The Volkssturm was sacrificed in these final urban battles. Elderly and teenagers with minimal training were sent to fight against professional troops with superior weaponry. The casualty rates were predictably horrendous. In some battles, 70 or 80% of the Volkssturm units were annihilated. These were not professional soldiers dying in combat, but forcibly conscripted civilians sent to hopeless battles. The Battle of Berlin represented the climax of this disaster. Approximately 40,000 members of the Volkssturm, mainly young people between 13 and 18 years old and elderly men, were used to defend the capital. They fought alongside remnants of the Wehrmacht against 3 Soviet armies totaling more than 2 million soldiers. The outcome was inevitable from the beginning. Between 20,000 and 40,000 military and civilian deaths occurred during the battle. Large areas of the city were reduced to rubble. Even the last week of the war was tremendously costly. After the suicide of Hitler on the 30th of April, Admiral Dönitz took over as successor and continued the fight for 8 additional days. Between the 1st and the 8th of May of 1945, 220,000 German soldiers were captured by the Red Army. 1,600,000 were captured by Western forces during the same period. These soldiers could have been saved through immediate surrender after Hitler's death. The long-term impact of these last few months was devastating for Germany. The cities reduced to rubble would require decades to rebuild. The destroyed industrial infrastructure severely limited the post-war economic capacity. The loss of millions of men of productive age created demographic imbalances that lasted generations. Hitler's final orders not only caused massive suffering, but also greatly complicated the post-war reconstruction. Every city that resisted, until being reduced to ruins, required almost total reconstruction. The fall of the Supreme Command. Useless orders from the bunker. During the last weeks of April of 1945, Adolf Hitler directed the defense of Germany from an underground bunker located beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. This reinforced concrete complex, built 9 meters underground, had become the command center of an empire that no longer existed. From these narrow, damp rooms, permanently illuminated by artificial light, Hitler issued his final orders to armies that had ceased to exist, moved phantom divisions on outdated maps, and planned counter-offensives with forces that would never arrive. The contrast between the grandiosity of his plans and the misery of his situation perfectly encapsulated the total bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. Hitler's progressive isolation from reality had begun long before his final descent into the bunker. For years, his inner circle had learned that reporting bad news led to outbursts of rage and accusations of defeatism. Generals and officers who reported objectively desperate situations were accused of cowardice or treason. As a result, the flow of information to Hitler became increasingly distorted. Subordinates learned to present news in the least provocative way possible, emphasizing any positive development, no matter how marginal, and minimizing obvious disasters. By April of 1945, this systematic distortion of reality had reached grotesque proportions. Hitler operated with maps that showed units that had been destroyed weeks earlier. He believed that divisions that existed only on paper were still effective combat forces. He planned movements of armies that had no fuel to move, ammunition to fight with, or will to obey. The gap between what Hitler believed was happening and what was actually occurring on the battlefield had widened into an unbridgeable abyss. The orders issued from the bunker during these last days reflected this complete disconnection from reality. On the 20th of April, Hitler's birthday, the Red Army launched its final offensive against Berlin. 2 Soviet fronts with more than 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces converged on the German capital from the north and the south. The German forces defending the city consisted of shattered remnants of Wehrmacht units, increasingly desperate SS formations, and approximately 40,000 members of the Volkssturm. The disproportion was so obvious that even the most fanatical Nazis recognized that the fall of Berlin was only a matter of days. But Hitler refused to accept this reality. On April 21st, he ordered the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Felix Steiner, to launch a massive counterattack against the flank of the Soviet advance. This order completely ignored the fact that the so-called Steiner's Corps was merely an ad hoc combat group formed from remnants of shattered units, military, academy cadets, and maintenance personnel hastily converted into infantry. It did not have the strength, equipment, or logistical support necessary to execute a significant counterattack, much less stop 2 complete Soviet fronts. Steiner, an experienced commander who understood perfectly the impossibility of the order, simply did not execute it. He did not have the means to fulfill it and recognized that attempting it would only cause the senseless annihilation of the forces under his command. When Hitler discovered that the counterattack had not materialized, he suffered an emotional collapse that several witnesses described as the most severe of the entire war. He shouted that he had been betrayed by everyone, that the generals were incompetent and cowards, that the German people had proven to be unworthy of his leadership. This outburst marked the moment when Hitler apparently accepted that the war was lost. But even after this collapse, Hitler continued to issue orders that had no connection to operational reality. On the 22nd of April, he ordered the 12th Army of General Walter Wenck, positioned on the western front near the Elbe River, to abandon its defensive position against the Americans and march eastward to relieve Berlin. This order required the 12th Army to turn its back on one enemy, march more than 100 kilometers through partially occupied territory, break through the Soviet lines encircling Berlin, and then fight its way to the city center. All this without air superiority, with inadequate supplies, and against an enemy overwhelmingly superior in number. Wenck, like Steiner, recognized the impossibility of the mission. But unlike Steiner, Wenck made a genuine attempt to partially fulfill the order. Not because he believed he could save Berlin, but because he understood that an advance eastward could open a corridor of escape for German civilians and soldiers attempting to flee from Soviet vengeance. The 12th Army advanced eastward and even managed to establish contact with remnants of the 9th Army attempting to break the Soviet encirclement. But it never had a real chance of reaching Berlin. By the end of April, Wenck's advance had stalled, and his forces were being pushed back westward. Simultaneously, Hitler ordered General Theodor Buss's 9th Army to abandon its position southeast of Berlin and counterattack towards the capital. This order ignored that the 9th Army was completely surrounded by Soviet forces, low on ammunition and fuel, and simply fighting to survive. Busse, facing the choice between obeying a suicidal order or saving what was left of his forces, opted for the latter. Instead of counter-attacking towards Berlin, he organized a desperate attempt to break the Soviet encirclement to the west, to join up with Wenck's 12th Army and eventually reach the American lines. This direct disobedience illustrated how Hitler's control over his armies had completely collapsed. Communications between the bunker and field units were intermittent. Orders issued from Berlin frequently did not reach their recipients. When they did, the field commanders evaluated them according to their own assessment of the tactical reality and frequently opted to ignore them. The centralized command system that Hitler had meticulously built over the years had disintegrated into decentralized chaos, where each commander acted according to his own judgment. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere became increasingly surreal. Hitler spent hours studying maps of Berlin, planning the defense street by street. He argued with his generals about the best way to employ divisions that no longer existed. He expressed confidence that the German miracle weapons would change the course of the battle. He alternated between manic optimism about imminent victories and deep depression about betrayal and failure. The constant Soviet bombardment regularly shook the bunker, interrupting meetings and sending cascades of concrete dust from the ceiling. The bunker staff watched this spectacle with a mixture of persistent loyalty, disbelief, and growing despair. Some fanatical Nazis like Joseph Goebbels remained completely committed until the end, proclaiming that they would fight to the death in the ruins of Berlin. Others, like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, began quietly exploring personal survival options, contacts with the Western Allies, and possible peace negotiations. When Hitler discovered these betrayals during his final days, he reacted with fury, but already lacked the power to effectively punish his former lieutenants. On the 28th of April, Hitler learned that Himmler had been trying to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. This betrayal by the Reichsführer of the SS, the man whom Hitler referred to as der treue Heinrich, or the loyal Heinrich, was perhaps the most emotionally devastating blow of all. Hitler had tolerated Himmler's incompetencies as a military commander because he absolutely trusted his personal loyalty. Discovering that even Himmler had abandoned him seemed to break something fundamental in Hitler. He ordered that Himmler be arrested and executed, but the order could not be fulfilled because Himmler had already fled Berlin. On April 29, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker. That same night, he dictated his political and personal testament. In these final documents, Hitler did not express remorse for the policies that had led Germany to disaster. Instead, he blamed the Jews for starting the war, accused his generals of treason and incompetence, and urged the German people to continue the fight against international Jewry. He designated Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as head of state, and Joseph Goebbels as the new Reich Chancellor. On the 30th of April of 1945, while Soviet forces fought less than 500 meters, from the Chancellery, Hitler committed suicide along with Eva Braun. Their bodies were taken to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline and partially incinerated. The remains were hastily buried in a bomb crater. The next day, Joseph Goebbels, who had been appointed Chancellor just hours earlier, also committed suicide, along with his wife Magda, after poisoning their 6 children. The leadership structure of the Third Reich had literally self-destructed. Dönitz, operating from Flensburg near the Danish border, attempted for 8 more days to selectively continue the war, surrendering forces to the Westerners while still fighting the Soviets. The Allies rejected this strategy and demanded unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously. On the 7th of May, General Alfred Jodl signed the German military surrender in Reims. On the 8th of May, Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a second surrender in Berlin before Soviet authorities. The war in Europe had finally ended. Hitler's last orders from the bunker had been as useless as they were predictable. They did not save Berlin, did not stop the Soviets, did not change the outcome of the war. They only prolonged the agony, caused more senseless deaths, and added another layer of suffering to an already immeasurable tragedy. The contrast between the omnipotence Hitler had exercised for years and his total impotence during the last few weeks perfectly illustrated the complete collapse of the Nazi regime.